the minerals deal with Ukraine has helped to improve relations between the US, Ukraine, perhaps even a couple of EU countries. But certainly it's Russia, which is now seen as the partner in this, which is bringing the least to the table despite several US efforts to get them there.
Now, let's cross to the States and the Times and Sunday Times new Washington editor, Katy Balls. Welcome once more, Katy. Good morning to you over there.
Good morning from here.
Yeah. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the visiting leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Poland have held a phone call with Donald Trump today. I'm sure that went swimmingly. Do you know anything at all about it?
Well, we know that Donald Trump is keen to end the conflict, and I think as we pass that 100-day mark, it's become a source of increasing frustration. Frustration he's not airing as publicly, perhaps, that he hasn't managed to do so. So when it comes to that phone call, I think there's clear an appetite from the US side to get this done. But we also had J.D. Vance this week speaking at an event related to the Munich conference. And he said the US was more focused on long-term Ukraine peace rather than these temporary ceasefires. That said, I don't think the Americans are going to be against this. The question is, what would make this difference to previous brief ceasefires, and do both sides abide for it? Certainly, I think in Washington, the feeling at the moment is that the White House is growing increasingly frustrated with Russia. The minerals deal with Ukraine has helped to improve relations between the US, Ukraine, perhaps even a couple of EU countries. But certainly it's Russia, which is now seen as the partner in this, which is bringing the least to the table despite several US efforts to get them there.
What a surprise. I noticed that the Ukrainian foreign minister has written on X very recently that Ukraine and its allies were ready for a full unconditional ceasefire on land, air and sea for at least 30 days starting on Monday. Has any of this shifted the perspective in Washington that the Europeans are utterly useless and are wasting their time talking to Zelensky?
I don't think that the Europeans are seen as completely useless in talking to Zelensky. I just think that often there's a view of the politicians here that they're a bit surplus to requirements. And, what are they all bringing to the table? I think certainly the UK government's held in a higher regard than some of the other European governments when it comes to, various things, but having that line to Zelensky. And it can be quite a useful tool when relations break down or they need someone to, soften something so one side gets in it to have the Europeans there. But we've also had a period where lots of the European leaders have just been quite vocally critical of the American government, which obviously goes down very badly, like a cough, cold, sick with the White House.
Yes. I've got to ask you this because I'm not sure where I stand on it. This trade deal, does it look as if the UK got what it wanted? Will we get more? Was it a good deal for the UK, or are the Americans sniggering behind our backs and saying, you dupes?
I think there's definitely a lot of Americans patting themselves on the back and saying it's a great deal for America. But I think it's also the case that the deal does not make things worse for the UK, and it does make things at the very least a bit better. Now, although Donald Trump called it this big, beautiful deal and, laid it on pretty thick, including holding Peter Mandelson's hand in that conference at one point, it isn't such a complete deal. And I think the UK hope is that they've managed to get a deal fairly quickly, which alleviates some of these quite difficult tariffs that Donald Trump announced. Now, the UK is in one of the best positions of a country when it comes to tariff exemptions on certain industries. And then they now hope to use that as, a building block towards, closer working together on tech, other areas where they can get more from the US going forward. So I don't think I think it's certainly a fairly positive thing. It probably just doesn't completely match up to the rhetoric of Number 10 or even Donald Trump and what it means for the UK.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you're right. Now, your Sunday Times column, you've been busy with your spade, exhuming the corpse of Joe Biden from whatever tomb he resides in. He's made a bit of a comeback. The Democrats aren't necessarily pleased about his media tour, are they?
No, and the thing is, I haven't had to dig very deep because Biden is everywhere at the moment in DC. If you turn on any cable news channel, there are endless discussions, particularly on the right, about why is Joe Biden back? This is the best thing to happen to Donald Trump in his just over 100
Yes.
days. Um, and obviously, it's the BBC interview Joe Biden initially did. Then he went on The View, which is a fairly soft US talk show program here. And he also seemed to contradict himself in those two appearances, saying, he gave Kamala Harris plenty of time. She was a good candidate. And then saying the next day, oh, I never thought she could win, but I would have won if I'd stayed. And certainly speaking to Democrats here, there is a feeling of he needs to go away. We don't really want what is a rehabilitation tour attempt. And there's a worry that when some think for his own sake, he should just take a period away from the spotlight. Others think he's damaging the brand further. And it's about to get worse because you have another book coming out in about a week's time by Jake Tapper from CNN about what went on behind the scenes when it came to Joe Biden's apparent decline. There's already another two books out. Donald Trump's team really want to keep attacking Joe Biden because they think it's one of their easiest lines. So the Democrats' Joe Biden problem, I think, is about to actually get a lot worse.
Well, I look forward to all of that. And finally, Trump's deputy chief of staff has been talking about, quotes, actively looking, end quotes, at suspending habeas corpus if courts frustrate their various deportation plans. That's going to annoy the Democrats and quite a few other people in America, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it would probably also annoy some who would class themselves as Republican, but perhaps not, but not the Make America Great Again movement, if that makes sense, more the traditional
Yeah, it does.
ones. Yeah, I mean, this is something I touched on in my column for the Sunday Times last week, which is when you think about the next 100 days. I had reassuringly Steve Bannon, who used to work for Donald Trump and now is still very pivotal in the movement, saying the next 100 days are actually far more decisive and are probably going to make the past 100 look like a walk in the park. And one of the battles he said to me was this showdown with the courts, which is all these emergency powers that the Trump administration have been using to deport. We've seen all the pictures of those being forced out of the country. If that does keep to get challenged, you could get a showdown in the Supreme Court by May or June. And generally speaking, Donald Trump has a decision to make, which is if the courts don't go along with what they want, do they listen to it or do they do habeas corpus?
Yeah.
Last time that happened was Abraham Lincoln. Of course, the US at that point was in a civil war. You will speak to some in the MAGA movement and they will say, well, this is akin to a civil war because immigration is such a big problem. But as
Yes,
you
they think
allude
it's
to,
also a civil war, don't they?
exactly. They will say this is a civil war and this is a battle for the future of America, and therefore drastic measures are needed. So if it does come to that, and what will decide this is, what the courts decide in the coming weeks and months. Certainly, the White House want to be able to say that they have this as an option. Would they really go ahead with it? I think there are definitely some in the movement pushing hard that they should. You will see a big showdown, not just between the courts and the government, but also I think the various voters and parties, and it's going to get pretty messy before anything is resolved.